अंग्रेज अपना लगान और न्यूज लॉन्ड्री अपना हफ्ता कभी नहीं छोड़ते. We are bringing you hafta from our new studio with new lights and all that. And you can see we're also recording it on video this time. But the full episode is only available on audio for subscribers only. So all you Mufat khors, about time you subscribe and pay to keep news free. Because unless you pay for news, advertisers will. And that doesn't always end up in your favor. So on that note, let me first introduce the panel. We are recording Hafta episode 374 on a Thursday afternoon on the 31st of March at 3:15 in the late afternoon. Joining me in the studio is Manisha Pande. Hi, Manisha.
Hello.
She's back after a week's leave. Raman Kirpal.
Hi.
Also joining
I
us
came
is...
back last week only, yaar.
But you weren't here for last Hafta. No, you came back this week.
I was there last hafta.
No, you weren't.
You weren't.
No, I
Okay,
was
she's
there.
No, you were
confused.
not.
You had gone...
Oh, no, I wasn't there.
You
You're
were
right,
smoking
correct,
ganja
yeah.
somewhere, clearly. So, joining us in the studio is Puja Mehra. Hi, Puja.
Hi.
Puja is a journalist. You have seen her on Hafta before a couple of times. She has had a reporting career of 17 years. She was formerly a senior deputy editor at The Hindu. She's won the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism in 2009, sorry, 19 bol raha hu. And she's also written the book, The Lost Decade, 2008-18, How India's Growth Story Devolved into Growth Without a Story. Welcome, Puja.
Thank you.
Also joining us from not inside the studio is our very own Jayashree. Hi, Jayashree. Joining us from Chennai. And joining us is R Ramakumar. Hi, Ramakumar. Ramakumar he's an economist and a writer. He's a professor with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. He's been a contributing writer for the Indian Express. Ramkumar has analysed the Sri Lankan crisis and done a series of threads on Twitter explaining it. Welcome, Ramkumar. There's lots to explain for our viewers. The last few episodes of Hafta have been so much about Kashmir files and Hindu Muslim and this, that and the other. We thought let's focus on an issue that actually impacts everybody's pockets. So that is where we are.
And also, while Pakistan has been spoken a lot about on mainstream media, Sri Lanka hasn't got that kind of space.
Yes.
So it'll be interesting to know.
So let me go across to Ram first. One is what's happening in Sri Lanka. I just read a bit on it this morning. And The Economist has a piece saying that one was, maybe you'll have more details, I'm sure you will, that a very significant chunk of their GDP came from tourism. And first it was done by COVID. And then I didn't know a very large chunk of the tourism comes from Russia. And then the war did the rest of it in. So that's from this morning, the Economist's podcast. I was like, oh, wow, I don't remember seeing any Russian tourists in Sri Lanka, but probably there's one corner of Sri Lanka where they do, flock the place. But A, how much of it is mismanagement? B, how much of it is just bad luck? And C, is this one of those situations which I remember back when I was in school and college, that IPKF, why does India have to send someone in? If we don't go in, China will come in. The same thing with the ports. I believe in Sri Lanka, the ports are being taken over by China. And, if India doesn't go in, China will go in. Are we looking at some sort of a geopolitically significant intervention? Or this is just cyclical little pass?
Okay, so this crisis in China, in Sri Lanka that we see is very complicated because it has a number of factors leading up to it, historical and contemporary. The dominant narrative in India is related to China, that China has trapped Sri Lanka into some kind of a debt trap. And that's why Sri Lanka is in this kind of trouble. In my view, that's far from truth. It's the product of a motivated campaign, possibly aided by some interested sections. If you look at the total foreign loans that Sri Lanka has taken, only less than 10% comes from China. And there is a detailed case study of the Hambantota port, which you can look at in the literature, which will basically tell you that Sri Lanka actually gained foreign exchange to the tune of $1.2 billion and did not lose anything when the debt trap actually came. Hambantota port was actually leased for 99 years to a Chinese group. And the Chinese group actually paid $1.2 billion to the Sri Lankan government, which it used to add to its foreign exchange reserves. So it did not lead to a foreign exchange problem. If at all, it eased its foreign exchange problem. So this Chinese role is thoroughly overplayed. in my view. This is primarily to hide few other players who have contributed significantly to exacerbating the Sri Lankan crisis. The Sri Lankan crisis is certainly historical. Historical in the sense, here is a country, like, for example, a state like Kerala in the southern part of India. The British introduced new crops into the cropping pattern: coffee, tea, rubber, coconut, etc. And when the country became independent in 1948, about 3/4 of its GDP was being contributed by these primary commodity exports. Now, typically a country, as it develops over a period of time, will come out of this kind of a developmental pathway. But that was not to be the case in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka failed to move out, like many African countries or many Latin American countries, move out of the orbit of this primary commodity exports-led economic development. Over a period of 50 to 60 years, if you see, only a few changes have happened to the economic structure of this country. There was primary commodity exports. There is still primary commodity exports: tea, rubber, coconut, etc. Garments and their export get added to it. Tourism gets added to it. And remittances get added to it, because a lot of Sri Lankan workers work across the globe, including in many European countries, and they send home a lot of money. So basically here is a country which lives by the export of primary commodities, tourism, and remittances. These three give it foreign exchange. Using this foreign exchange, it imports rice, wheat, pulses, meat, milk, fish, whatever it wants to eat. It also uses these dollars to buy whatever intermediate goods it requires in the non-agricultural sector. This is the simple skeleton of the Sri Lankan economy and how it functions today. It is in this context that the crisis has come. Sorry.
No, Sri Lanka imports fish?
Well, to an extent, because Sri Lanka has not yet adequately invested enough to meet its own fish requirements.
Wow,
a lot of fish comes
crazy.
from Indonesia and that Eastern Asian parts, countries. It's still not fully sufficient in fish production. So here, basically, this is the historical factor that has been the context for this particular crisis. Sri Lanka has been extremely vulnerable to whatever happens across the globe because of this kind of an economic structure. Now, there was this long war which ended in 2009, after which Sri Lanka comes out. But then that's also a very bad time, because that's when global commodity prices start falling from about 2011 or 12. When the global commodity prices start falling, Sri Lanka enters into another crisis, because exports are not fetching enough foreign exchange reserves as in the past to buy what is required in the consumption side. So the foreign exchange situation worsens. In 2015 and 16, Sri Lanka is actually forced to go in for an IMF loan. Now, remember, this is the point to underline here. The role of China is being overplayed to hide the role of the IMF. The loan that Sri Lanka received in 2016 was the 16th IMF loan that Sri Lanka received after 1965-66. 16th IMF loan. Each of these 16 loans from the IMF were linked to conditionalities, where Sri Lanka was asked to cut its budget deficit, open it up to foreign capital, slash food subsidies, the typical Washington...
The usual,
recommendations. And that role is completely being sidestepped by this China, playing up this China factor. The 16th loan was the last loan that they took. It went from 2016 to 2019. The recommendations were almost the same, but then they failed. The economy slid down again. GDP growth rates did not rise. Investment did not rise. Foreign exchange reserves continued to get depleted. And then two shocks come in 2019. The April Easter bombings of churches and hotels in Colombo in 2019 leads to a huge fall of tourists. And then in 2019, December, a new government of Gotabaya Rajapaksa does something completely irrational. Well, the first thing that he did, second was the organic farming thing that he did later. But in 2019 December, they cut VAT taxes by from 15% to 8%, abolished a number of other taxes, etc., which basically almost halved the total revenues of the state from VAT and so on. So tourism revenues came down, foreign exchange reserves depleted even further. Then came the VAT reduction and government revenues again fell.
And then COVID.
Then COVID came in 3-4 months, right? So the bad became worse. So again, tourists fell, again, exports fell, again, foreign exchange reserves depleted, and then it walked into yet another balance of payments crisis, which is what we are seeing now.
So, okay, Puja, you also report on economy and are a business journalist, broadly speaking. How much of what Ramkumar said, as far as the Washington consensus is concerned, would you say is it to blame? And just for our listeners, the data that I've just pulled out is about 13% of, as of 2019, of Sri Lanka's GDP comes from tourism. So that is straight away gone. There's not a single tourist coming in. So that is a huge fall. And from the geopolitical point of view, is this one of those situations where there will be pressure, whether imagined or genuine or contrived, for India to get in? Because if India doesn't get in, China will get in. Is there any of that could play out going forward?
I'll answer the second question first. You see, what happens is that when China was invited by Sri Lanka to build the Hambantota port or many such other projects, and this was on debt, and Sri Lanka could not repay that debt because of various problems that Ramkumar has explained and certain other that I will in the course of answering your first question. So when they could not repay that debt, China forced them to convert this into a 99-year lease. Now, what the 99-year lease does is that neither you're going to be alive, nor I'm going to be alive, but 10 years later, China will come and say, oh, you still owe us money for something, and you're not paying us back. Okay, now let's do a lease on this. Let's do in dibs and drabs, they will end up reducing the sovereignty of Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka geographically is located in a position, in a place where that could mean a national security threat for India. It could also mean an economic security threat for India, because 75% of the shipping operations that go on the Colombo airport are for all the trade that comes to India. So, Sri Lanka is very important strategically for India for both economic and national security reasons. And therefore, when China goes and invests in ports which have no commercial value, the Hambantota port has no commercial value at all. It was unviable from the first day it was even thought of. Then why has China gone and invested and built this port, which they know Sri Lanka will never be able to repay? So therefore, all the concerns about the geopolitical concerns are not imagined. They're quite genuine. And India should be concerned, and India should bail out and help Sri Lanka to the extent possible, because it's in India's own security interests. On the first question, I don't have ideological positions for or against China or IMF. Just looking at the facts of the matter, the point is that Sri Lankan economy is going through a huge macroeconomic crisis, and the crisis has historical reasons and reasons which are which come out of the structure of the economy, like how Ramkumar explained. But also, Sri Lanka is not the only economy in the world that has relied on IMF packages over the years to come out of economic crisis. India did too. Sri Lanka is not the only economy with this kind of economic structure that has been hit by COVID. A lot of other countries have been too. So what is peculiar to Sri Lanka that has put them in such a grave crisis? I think what is peculiar to Sri Lanka is that this is a completely policy-induced crisis. It's the biggest economic disaster, I think, so far in the last many decades in the world because of policy errors by the government, one of which includes inviting countries like China to build infrastructure on sweet terms.
Worse than Libya and Venezuela?
I haven't studied those two economies as well to be able to compare, and I don't say anything unless I'm very sure of what I'm saying. But so to talk about Sri Lanka, let me give you a personal example. If you've been to Colombo for a holiday, you would have been to what is called the Independence Square Arcade. Have you?
Where all the Gap Shop, all that stuff?
Yeah. So the Independence...
Where everybody buys 10
so
years
the
worth
Independence
of
Square
wardrobe.
Arcade was a mental asylum that the British had built. And the last time when Rajapaksa was Defence Secretary, he thought of how to convert this into a state of the into a posh shopping arcade using government funds. So they used government funds and the resources of the state, the Sri Lankan Navy, the Sri Lankan Army, send them to overseas countries to study how the architecture could be restored, how a completely posh shopping arcade could be built, and it's beautiful. They did a very beautiful. It's huge, and they did a beautiful job of it. It has wooden floors, the flooring, the roof, the ceilings, etc. have been restored, and a lot of money went into it. A lot of national resources went into it. But once it was ready, there were no shoppers because no Sri Lankans can afford to buy the kind of products that are sold in these malls. And this is just one example. There are many such projects to which state resources were diverted.
So was the thinking to target tourists? Like, was that their main thinking?
If you ever go to this arcade, you wouldn't see too many people. They can't run.
Packed.
It was never commercially viable.
Yeah.
Like all of the other infrastructure projects, this was also a vanity project, which was never commercially viable. But the shop owners were not allowed to close shop, even though they were running into losses, and through strong arm tactics of strong politicians, because this is a vanity project. We know where Hambantota Port is, whose constituency that is. And these are the kind of the tax cut that Ramkumar talked about. These are the kind of sort of policy errors, the organic farming, etc., that politicians sort of force on their people, and things go wrong. And then they look for, who to blame. I'm not, if you want to follow an economic policy program, go by what the domain expert tells you to do. Do not mix it with your own political calculations, your own personality cult calculations, and then say, the IMF did this and China did that. And I mean,
Okay. So you're saying it was mismanagement by politicians. Fair enough. Although, like you're right, that a lot of countries have taken IMF loans, but the criticism of the IMF of pushing the Washington consensus is not new. And in fact, now even former ideological allies like the Economist are questioning the narrative that they pushed in the 80s and 90s, that also India's aid wasn't without strings. I mean, I personally am not, my politics may be left of center, but my economics definitely is not. But I do think that to have such immense market power in a country where a consumer doesn't have the power to push back, like I can't take Mukesh Ambani to court and win $2 million, whereas you can take McDonald's to court.
Is IMF responsible for that?
No,
or
but
is India's crony capitalism
responsible? It is, but what I'm saying is that
responsible
the transition to market, I think, has to be preceded by certain consumer reforms, empowering the consumer, judicial reforms.
So sequencing is in the hands of
Correct,
the most...
I agree, but what I'm saying is it's not... I don't think it's unreasonable. It's not an unreasonable narrative, which has been acknowledged even by those who...
I think it needs nuance. It's
it does.
neither this way nor that way.
Right.
The reason even I write saying that, the so-called Washington consensus needs to be questioned. I mean, who am I to question? We've seen in both the global financial crisis as well as the current COVID crisis, even the White House is not sort of doing... I mean, they've blown their fiscal deficit to the sky, their public debt levels to the sky. But there's a difference, look at their debt sustainability, their ability to repay that debt, and that of a country like Sri Lanka or India.
Right.
Sri Lanka's fiscal deficit is more than 12% of GDP right now. Their current account deficit is close to 4% of GDP right now. Even if you do not go to the IMF, and if you go to anybody who knows basic macroeconomics, will tell you that you have to, take care of these things.
No, absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah,
Sure.
and if IMF told India in 1991 that you have to clean up your fiscal mess, that, you have to stop monetizing the debt, or you have to, privatize your PSUs, which are producing nothing, but, taxpayers are just paying for their salaries. That is commonsensical. I don't see what is,
Sure.
the
It's not necessarily an
sequencing.
ideological
Yeah,
position. So
yeah.
I'll come back to you, but Ramkumar, because go ahead. Yes, Jayashree, go ahead.
I just want to jump in on the China death trap and the port thing, because I think Atlantic had this really case piece called "The Chinese Death Trap is a Myth." It basically broke down the entire story of Hapantota. It pointed out that I think it was a Canadian agency, that not China, that had financed the entire feasibility study for the port. Then the central bank governors under both Rajapaksa and Sirisena had said that Hapantota and Chinese finance in general and in specific was not the source of financial distress. There was also never a default, because Colombo had arranged the bailout from the IMF. And then they decided to raise their much needed money by leasing out the very underperforming Hapantota port to an experienced company, which the Canadians had also recommended that they do. And then they got only 2 bids, I think, once they did try. They got only 2 bids for that. And so they were both from Chinese companies. So therefore it was leased out. So the entire point of it was that, there is this entire sort of slightly propagandized narrative, I think, of sort of wrongfully portraying Beijing and the developed countries that it deals with as being part of this entire nexus. But I think specific to Hapantota, that the Atlantic had access to a lot of paperwork that said quite differently.
No, that's not what I'm saying. See, in fact, when the Chinese were first approached, they turned down the project, So that's not the thing. The thing is, I don't think it is propaganda. You have to understand what the Chinese strategy is over here. I think for me, the concern is not whether China is responsible for demolishing or, damaging the Sri Lankan economy or not. The concern that I am raising is that, because they're involved in so many projects,
You
and
leverage
the
the
terms,
situation.
yeah,
Sure.
the
I mean,
terms of the project is such that, they own land now in Colombo.
Right, yeah.
So they are creeping.
It's leveraging.
It's a
it's
creeping
like saying-
acquisition.
It's like,
you know?
I mean, they haven't caused the political mess in many countries in Africa, but
they're
they will
taking
definitely
advantage
take
of it
advantage
for
of
their
it for theirs. So
advantage,
they will,
which turns out to be a strategic disadvantage.
Sure,
A
for
strategic
India.
threat for India.
Yeah. So, Ramkumar, on this, from your studies and research work, is India aware of it? Are we acting on this? Is it a significant risk or threat to us? And in a circumstance, if you want to weigh in on this at all, even briefly, where Pakistan and Sri Lanka are spiraling down a mess like they are, and Bangladesh suddenly his economy doesn't seem to be doing so well also all of a sudden.
Although they gave a line of credit to Sri Lanka of
Yeah.
200
Yes, they
million.
did. Yeah. So, do you have any comments on how we're doing? Just
I was just
as
going to come to that.
on economics
Modi ji ne
without
kuch
the
to kara hoga,
politics.
soch
Modi ji ne
samajh
kuch
ke.
to kara, soch samajh. Yeah.
No, I think the Indian position has been sort of a reactive and not proactive in this matter. I'm not overly concerned about geopolitics. India has geopolitical concerns, so has China. We have ambitions, so has China. So it's only a clash of ambitions that we are seeing here. And if you want to trumpet a patriotic bugle, you can. But then that's a different matter altogether. What I'm trying to say here is that India always has had an important stake in the politics and economics of Sri Lanka. Over a period of time, we have had free trade agreements with Sri Lanka. But at some point, when the right-wing offensive took place in the political scene of Sri Lanka, India lost that kind of a link with Sri Lankan politics. That kind of influence that India had in Sri Lankan politics does not exist anymore. That's the gap into which China may have walked in using its economic prowess. And the Hambantota port case, the Sri Lankan Port Authority first approached United States for a loan. They refused. Then they came to India. India refused. That's when Chinese Exim Bank comes into the picture with a $300 million loan. So it's not that, of course, I mean, if they came for a loan and they said, okay, we'll give you a loan. That's it. Now, that loan has a particular history. The Atlantic article that Jayashree was mentioning is very important as a case study because they looked at thousands of documents through the Freedom of Information Act in Canada and other countries. So you'll basically see that here was the first proposal first by SNC Lavalin in Canada and then by Ramboll in Denmark. The idea was that Hambantota port would be a non-container port, right? And this was changed by Rajapaksa into a container port. And that change from non-container port to container port meant that yet another $700 million had to be loaned in from Chinese Exim Bank for that phase 2 of the project, which was obvious to everybody that it is infeasible or unviable.
Right.
Right? So basically, it was Rajapaksa who walked into that debt trap. And I don't see, and I don't see that there's a difference between dependency and debt trap. Let me draw that line here. Is Sri Lanka dependent on China? Probably yes, because that's the only country coming in with loans and investments. India is not. India is offering very little money, either as loan or grant to Sri Lanka, and that's not attractive to Sri Lanka.
The point is, what is China doing with this dependency? They're slowly sort of increasing their control, if not ownership, of strategic projects and ports in Sri Lanka, and they're doing it through 100-year leases. And 10 years from now, 20 years from now, how they're going to make use of it, how they're going to increase, because every 20 years Sri Lanka will go back, have a crisis, go back to them again, they will use it. So what will happen 100 years from now is what we're talking about.
Cyclical nature of economics, it's hard to imagine it going
because it's not getting resolved. They're just sort of it's a spiral. They're going down under.
Right,
they're sinking.
For those viewers who haven't been to Sri Lanka and the mall, that we are speaking about, I don't wear suits, but I was there with a bunch of friends of mine who wear suits. So you get like Hugo Boss suits for like 1/4 of their normal price. So I went in khali haath and I came out with 2-3 pairs of Keds.
And it's a state-owned.
But I thought they were so cheap because all this stuff is manufactured in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, like a lot of
And
the
before-
A lot of
have,
apparel.
And before the
like Zara and all is
stuff,
quite a bit
and
of
then
it is
before it
made
goes
in
out, they sell it like really cheap in these, that mall.
Yeah, but that mall is a
the
state
infrastructure is-
project. I mean,
sure.
so
Understood.
every time you're choosing a mall, you're not building, a project that will lower your manufacturing costs and improve the
Or it's
productivity of your
sustainable,
economy
sure.
and grow your GDP.
But would
That's
things
the
have been
trade-off.
so bad had there been no COVID? Like, do you think COVID was really
So what happens when you take wrong policy decisions is you make your economy vulnerable to black swan events, and by definition which cannot be foreseen. And when such a disaster strikes, you're so thin, you have no ability to face up to it. And this is pretty much what happened with India. We could not give relief. India could not give relief to poor people, any meaningful relief to poor people, because we were already so stretched. Our tax revenues were already so low, and this is what happens when you don't keep your economy and exchequer in good health, and then these unforeseen events happen, and they just push you to the brink.
Right. Now, the rest of this podcast will be available on audio only. That was the video one for all you Mufat Khors who don't pay to keep news free. But if you are a Mufat Khor, do consider paying for Newslaundry and subscribe. Go to newslaundry.com, click on the subscribe button and pay, because we don't take any ads from anybody. The rest of this podcast is audio only. The subscription model is something that keeps Newslaundry afloat, but we need hundreds of thousands of people to completely transform the news ecosystem. So you pay for news, so it serves you. So click on the link with this video, subscribe to Newslaundry and pay to keep news free, और गर्व से कहो मेरे खर्च पर आज़ाद है खबरें.